Welcome to the Rights Track podcast, where we aim to get the hard facts about the human rights challenges facing us today. I'm Todd Landman. In this series, the Rights Track is on the road, capturing the voices, experiences, and knowledge of people around the world who are part of the global coalition to end modern slavery by 2030. In today's episode, we're asking who is most likely to be a victim of trafficking and why. I'm joined by Dr Patricia Hynes from the University of Bedfordshire and Patrick Burland from the International Organization for Migration, whose research hopes to improve our understanding of what makes someone vulnerable to human trafficking. Together, they're looking at the experience of people being trafficked into the UK from Nigeria, Albania, and Vietnam, including their support needs when they arrive. In a moment, I want to ask you your thoughts on how we move the conversation about modern slavery forward. But first, our reporter Emily Brady has been speaking to Kieran Guilbert of the Thomson Reuters Foundation about a trafficking project they are leading, which they hope will achieve this.
We're profiling 5 survivors around the world with really different stories. We're looking at a Nigerian woman who was sex trafficked to Italy. We're looking at a woman in Mauritania who was born into descent-based slavery and lived on, or was an unknowing slave until she was about 30, when she was taken out of the domestic servitude situation and was told that they weren't your family, you were actually a slave. We have the story of these 2 sisters from Kazakhstan who were trafficked to a shop in Moscow, where they were then sexually exploited and enslaved for about 8 years before they got out and managed to return to Kazakhstan. So by telling these different stories and profiling these survivors, I think it's a really good chance for us to present the stories of the survivors in their own words, and to be much more forward-looking, and to basically present this story in a way that's saying the narrative has moved on, the world has the knowledge now of kind of what trafficking and slavery entails, but what's still lacking is what's next for survivors, what's the next step, what more needs to be done. So I think what we're really excited about is that it will be one of the first media projects to really, in a huge way, we think, with visuals, with the survivors speaking on camera, with their stories really illustrated, to hopefully help to explain to a wider audience and the general public that freedom from slavery is not the end of the road. Actually, it's the beginning of a new journey when there's needs like housing, like healthcare, like counselling, at a very basic level, and then education, jobs, community reintegration. So hopefully, by telling that whole story in with a full picture and in a comprehensive way as possible, it helps shift the conversation and move it on again.
So we heard from that clip from Kieran Guilbert of the Thomson Reuters Foundation about the sort of vulnerability of people being tipped into trafficking, how they get involved in trafficking, where they come from. He's talking about people from countries that are not part of your study and going to places not necessarily to the United Kingdom. But the work that you've been doing in your case studies and this model that you have around the determinants of vulnerability would be of great interest to followers of this podcast. So just to start, if you could comment a bit on what you've heard from Kieran, and also develop a little bit more about what the model of vulnerability is that you're working with.
There was sort of 2 parts to the question, in a way. There was the question of whether profiling survivors to tell in their own words would lead us to a point where we could be more forward-looking and present their story. And there was a sort of a speculation that the narrative has moved on, in a way, and the world already has the knowledge now of what human trafficking and slavery entails. And I think what we're finding in the research we're doing on the countries we're looking at is that the world does have some knowledge about human trafficking and slavery, but we're questioning whether that's an accurate picture, or whether that's a picture based on essentially what we currently know, and that will change over time. So, for example, there may be new forms of exploitation that emerge over time. In the UK, we're currently experiencing a new issue coming out around county lines, children being run across counties for purposes of drug distribution. But we still have things that we need to understand better. So, for example, with the countries that we're looking at, there's certainly a disproportionate amount of knowledge generated around sexual exploitation, for example, as opposed to the other forms of exploitation that we've discovered within each of the countries. There's very little knowledge around the trafficking of men and boys from those 3 countries, and also the support needs of men and boys from those three countries. In terms of national statistics, we certainly found some gaps in recording statistics around trafficking within those countries. So that's another area as well. Whether we have all the knowledge already is a big question. there is also that next step for survivors. So we need that focus on the future as well as thinking about what we don't know already. So simultaneously, it's not one or the other. This idea of what survivors need is really an uninvestigated area. We know very little about what recovery means in terms of people who've been through this experience. So yeah, I think actually it's both. We need to look backwards, we need to look forwards. I don't think we can do just one of those things.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, one of the things that you point to is that we only know what we know from what people tell us, in the sense of, there's a selection bias around what people tell us, because it's in a sense a convenient sample of those people that we're able to speak to. But one question I have is that if we look at the National Referral Mechanism, which is the sort of UK system for support for survivors of modern slavery currently, is that the largest proportion of the people involved in the NRM still are UK nationals. But you've chosen to focus on people coming from Nigeria, Albania, and Vietnam. So why did you select, first of all, just those countries, and why the foreign aspects of this as opposed to the domestic aspects?
Well, at the time when we were pulling this proposal together, the Albanian, Vietnamese and Nigerian nationals were really in the top 4 of the NRM referrals. And UK at that time, when we started this, was in 4th place. So for us, it seemed logical to look overseas to understand the causes, or some people refer to that as root causes, so that we could really get that sense of why this is happening in the first instance. And I think the demographic around the UK referrals is slightly different in terms of it being about child sexual exploitation, etc. And what we wanted to look at were examples where we could use the IOM's determinants of migrant vulnerability model.
I would just say as well, in addition to that, on a sort of technical point as well, the criteria for the funding for the research was that the countries were ODA eligible countries. So it had to be kind of the countries we selected were kind of based on that.
Understood. Yeah, understood. So overseas development assistance, in some ways, it defines where we can look in the world to do that kind of work. But if I could go back a little bit, so you talked about survivors and future. A lot of the narrative analysis on survivors suggests that there's the difficulty in survivors articulating their experiences in the future tense. That there's almost a futureless world because of the experiences they had. So I'm interested in teasing that out, and then after that, perhaps we'll go back to thinking about the determinants. So this notion of the future, I'm very intrigued by that, and the sorts of things that you're finding out in how can a bright future be presented for people that have been through these experiences.
Well, I think one of the findings that we identified from actually traveling to the 3 countries, and where we traveled to Albania, Vietnam, and Nigeria, and conducted these kind of like 2-day events where we brought together a large number of stakeholders working in the sort of trafficking sector in the 3 countries to kind of share with us their knowledge about human trafficking in the country, and their understandings of some of the profiles and trends and vulnerabilities and the key areas which people might be coming from geographically in the country. And one of the kind of striking things that we identified through that process was a significant lack of knowledge about trafficking to the UK as a consequence of having worked with a very small number of survivors of trafficking. So in Albania, Vietnam, and Nigeria, there's very limited knowledge of victims of trafficking who have returned to those countries, who have then accessed support and assistance on their return and reintegration. And so one of the things we're kind of aware of through this research is that in the future of these people who have been trafficked, we understand that there's a lot of challenges for people from these 3 countries to remain in the UK longer term post their kind of immediate short-term reflection period and process of recovery in the UK. But actually, in the longer term, if they are returning to their countries of origin, where they were initially trafficked from, they're not returning to comprehensive programs of support and assistance. And that raises questions and concerns about the possibility for them to be re-trafficked in their futures.
I understand. Okay, so if we could then go back to root causes. So the IOM has this model about the determinants of vulnerability. Could you talk us through the main elements of that model?
It's a model that has kind of focused on 4 levels of vulnerability, which exist not only prior to a migration journey, but also during a migration experience and afterwards and upon arriving in a country of destination. So it tries to understand what might, at each of these levels, provide someone some protection against vulnerability and harm and abuse and exploitation in a migration journey and afterwards, but also what can provide them some protection and resilience during that journey. So the four levels then are the individual, the household and family, the community, and the structural. And so within the individual, the kind of traditional focus of trafficking research and understanding about trafficking of a person's age, their gender, their sort of material wealth, how, whether they're well paid or if they're poor, they have a good job or they don't have a job, their level of education, for example. But then at the household level, it thinks more about really understanding the kind of context and the lived experiences of which a person might come from. So what is the background of the household and family? How large is their household? Are their parents or the people in the household, do they have enough money to provide a safe, stable life for those people in their country? But then at the community level, it not only looks at, well, how does an individual live within their own household, but then what impact does the community which they live in, what impact might that have on protecting them from vulnerability or from creating situations of risk? So those things might be about community practices and community beliefs and practices. And we found that the community level has been quite a significant area of potential vulnerability to the backgrounds of people's lives who have found themselves being trafficked to the UK or to other countries in Europe. And at the structural, then we see the kind of the larger macro, all-encompassing focus, things like access to migration channels, the ability to migrate safely, and that being a key and important vulnerability that might actually exist for people once they arrive or travel to another country, so they could leave in a relatively safe fashion, but actually upon arriving in the UK, but there may be some vulnerabilities that exist post-arrival. What are the impacts of governance, the rule of law, corruption, the ability for the state to provide employment and social security and housing and a safe infrastructure for everyone to live safely and to be free of risk and challenges that might create pressure or vulnerabilities which they might seek to resist through migration.
So this is really a nice integrated way of looking at the problem from the what I would call the micro to the macro. And part of the macro story you're telling is around culture, practice, intersubjective understandings. It may be that people's vulnerability is unknown and hidden because people are not aware that this is actually happening because this is what's always been done. There's a kind of sedimentation of practice there that can have a negative impact on people's agency, and therefore they can be led into a trafficking situation almost unwittingly, supported by the local culture. Is that what you're finding as well?
Yes, absolutely. For example, in the case of Albania, we have a very strong honour code that almost operates in an unspoken way. We found when we were doing interviews that nobody really mentioned it very much until the point at which they had to leave, and they then discussed it as always being there. It was like this omnipresent sort of social norm, really, in a way, a very normalization of that type of structural violence that happens within societies. But also things around gender imbalance were inherent in that sort of structural aspect, and also the state's capacity to protect against those rights violations. So yes, I would say there are those elements, but also I think if you think about the interrelation between the community and the structural level, within Albania, for example, there was a lot of silence around some of the aspects we were looking at.
Yes, and so there's also an interaction, it seems to me, between the sort of political elements of the structural and the socioeconomic elements. So you talk about state capacity, governance, rule of law, human rights protection, etc., but you're also talking about quite grave socioeconomic chasms, and it may be possible that in even a relatively wealthy country that the dualities of the economy and the inequalities within an economy could put pressure or act as drivers for vulnerability in the sorts of things you're looking at.
Yes.
All right. So one of the things that I'm interested in is we had a podcast with Austin Choi Fitzpatrick, who works on perpetrators. So do you also, in your research, get information about the traffickers themselves?
Across the three countries, the profile of the traffickers can be quite different. But what we have learned about through the research is the realms in which a trafficker might be able to engage and recruit an individual who ends up being trafficked, and the role that the community and the households play, and the pressure that can be put on an individual for them to make a decision whether to choose to engage with someone who, turns out to be a trafficker, who approaches them with promises of education or employment or a better life overseas. So particularly in countries like Nigeria and Vietnam, through the research, is that we see traffickers can often have a strong connection to an individual who ends up being exploited, but they are connected through their family, through the local community. And traffickers can take advantage of and exploit existing relationships and community kind of beliefs, and the status and the role of the family and that individual within their community, and the higher status or privilege of an individual approaching them, can be very powerful and influential in that decision making for which a person ends up being trafficked.
You use the word recruitment, which is very interesting, almost a euphemism. I know in one of our podcasts with Dan Vexler, the work that Freedom Fund have been doing in Thailand, a very similar story came out of these promises of riches, promises of paid work on a fishing boat, and then when people get onto the fishing boat, they're not paid and they're not allowed to leave the boat. So you're finding similar sets of promises in your three cases, and equally this notion of status and hierarchy and imbalance of power is an important dimension.
There's a sort of uncertainty about the extent to which some of these potential recruiters for traffickers are necessarily actually aware of what the intentions are of these people who are offering opportunities. They might actually be, on the one hand, acting quite in a positive fashion for their friends or family, saying, we can provide this opportunity for you, this person can deliver it. But in some cases, there's more of a sort of sinister element to it, where there's a recognition that the family or friend may be gaining from that exploitative practice. So within this realm, we see a lot of intermediaries, a lot of complicated relationships, which might start within the household or the direct community, but the intention is unclear. And that is quite a powerful way for the young person or the individual to be convinced and to feel safe in taking this decision when they have come into the family home, have spoken to the parents, they might know the parents, or have a loose connection to them through this kind of ambiguous sense of family. In countries like Nigeria, where everyone is an uncle or an auntie, is often recalled to us as researchers, can be difficult to really pinpoint what is the exact familial relationship between those parties.
Yes, so there's a real, almost an anthropological and ethnographic quest to understand those networks and the language around those networks. The sense of ambiguity and uncertainty is exploited in certain ways, and the structure of incentives is there for the perpetrator to approach families and to, for lack of a better word, leverage access to vulnerable people. The UK is currently considering a victim support bill, which would extend potentially the period that survivors would spend in the national referral mechanism. Perhaps the 45-day period would be extended. There's new forms of support. There's a kind of delineation of support in one of the clauses of the bill that looks at adequate housing, mental health care, legal advice, etc., to help people. But one of the things you said quite early on was about this notion of return. So is it the case that many people from your three countries inevitably are going to be returned to those countries, or do they have asylum seeker status, or there are different categories of people come in that might raise the probability that they stay in the UK? And is the victim support bill something that you welcome as a positive development here in the UK?
I think I'll deal with the second part of the question, if that's okay. I think with the victim support bill, yes, we definitely support that. What's coming out of the interviews is that the 45-day reflection period is, of course, not long enough. It's not long enough to gain that relationship of trust or any type of therapeutic alliance between the survivor and the people who are trying to support that person. So an extension of that would be absolutely welcome. In fact, I think maybe the proposed 12-month extension perhaps is not even long enough. I think, in order to get to a point where people feel supported, they feel safe, they feel secure enough to be able to make the disclosures necessary to make their cases. I think, that takes a long time. That really takes a long time. And of course, we're dealing with really high levels of trauma here. Some of the experiences that people have had before they set out in a number of examples, and then en route are just, incredibly traumatizing. And then they arrive within the UK and experience this system that doesn't necessarily support them in the way they need supporting. So yes, it's a very welcome move. I think it's a good start. I think there's more work to be done after that.
Excellent, thank you. And Patrick, around this idea of return, what sort of proportion of people then are returned to the 3 countries where you're working?
So when we were in Nigeria, we had a number of representatives from the Nigerian anti-trafficking organisation, NAPTIP, the sort of central body that provides sort of the whole kind of spectrum of responses to trafficking, from prosecution, protection, prevention. And they presented to us statistics on the number of victims of trafficking that they'd worked with in Nigeria, including profiles about where they'd come from and where they'd gone to, and the process in which they returned. And I think the statistics were from, between 2013 and the end of 2017, was that they'd supported 6 returnees who had been trafficked to the UK. They had 6 people they'd worked with in Nigeria. So we can assume that the number of Nigerian victims of trafficking who might have returned back from the UK might be greater than 6 in that period of time, given that Nigeria has consistently been in the top 3, top 5 NRM referral countries. Currently, those statistics from an agency like NAPTIP, who are really central to working with victims of trafficking in the country, when they have worked with just a handful of people trafficked to the UK, would suggest that there is some disconnect between the process of them leaving the UK and them having the opportunity to access support and assistance while in Nigeria.
I guess my final question for you is, what are your next steps? So what do you do with this information? Clearly, the reports will be written, articles will be written. Do you have an engagement strategy to disseminate, to a wider community, the findings that you have received so far?
We've generated a really substantial data set. We have over 170 interviews, 68 of which are with survivors of trafficking. So yes, we do wish to disseminate that more widely. We're working currently, we haven't quite finished the final draft of the final report that we're due to disseminate in Parliament in March. We have a working title for that, which is Between Two Fires. That's an early indication of what the report will be about. But yes, we obviously want to disseminate this as widely as we can. You've
covered the sort of micro to macro elements of the determinants of vulnerability model, given us a very rich detail about the individual, family, community, structural aspects of vulnerability across those 3 countries where you're working. And this report, Between Two Fires, it sounds aptly named to me. And I hope that you have great success in getting that report out to Parliament and the broader sort of anti-slavery community, among others. So for now, I just want to take the opportunity to thank you for being on this episode of The Rights Track. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Rights Track, which was presented by Todd Landman and produced by Christine Garrington. You can find out more about our podcast at www.rightstrack.org. Funding for our Modern Slavery series comes from the University of Nottingham's Rights Lab project, home to the world's leading contemporary slavery experts and the world's first large-scale research platform for ending slavery.